Welcome to AU Manufacturing Conversations, the podcast where we explore the cutting edge of manufacturing innovation. I'm your host, Simran Gill. Today we're diving into some fascinating research that could reshape how we think about safety in fuel systems and energy storage. We're joined by Dr. Joe Berry and Dr. Peter Sherrell, whose work has revealed that water movement on surfaces can generate electrical charges far greater than previously understood. Dr. Berry is a chemical engineer specialising in fluid dynamics, while Dr. Sherrell brings expertise in materials science and engineering. Together, they've uncovered insights about the stick-slip motion of water that has significant implications for manufacturing. Let's explore how this research could impact manufacturing processes, product design, and safety protocols across multiple industries. Peter and Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Sim. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay, could each of you give us a snapshot of who you are and what sparks your passion in the world of chemical engineering and fluid dynamics?
Well, that's probably me, because Peter's neither of those things, although he was in the chemical engineering department. So that's a good question. So I've always been interested in fluid dynamics. So I did my PhD in computational fluid mechanics in mechanical engineering at Monash. And then I came across to chemical engineering because there's lots of interesting problems involving fluid dynamics and also mass and charge that are transported with fluids. So it's a really important concept in chemical engineering. So I've always been interested in fluids, and I started working with Peter on this about 3 years ago because there was an obvious overlap between my fluids expertise and his materials expertise, but I'll let Peter introduce that now.
Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, my background is not chemical engineering. I did my undergrad in nanotechnology, which is about, a smaller set of materials as you can get when you look at these big chemical engineering plants. But what I've always been passionate about is trying to find better ways to either use or store green energy, right? And so I've gone through journeys looking at making hydrogen as a fuel, storing it in supercapacitors or new generations of batteries, or figuring out, how we can sequester carbon dioxide. So I'm interested in that sort of energy space. And what sort of drove me into this project was we'd done a lot of work on these energy harvesting materials, and these are things that convert motion or heat into electricity. And there was a big gap there, and that is everyone had always been looking at sort of how solid materials do this and trying to understand how liquids do it as well, or how liquids interact with their environment to create some electrical charge was something that is really only starting to be studied very well in the past few years. And we saw a big opportunity to capture Joe's chemical engineering and fluid dynamics experience with, my energy harvesting background in interpretation. So it's been a really cool journey and lots of fun doing it. And I've learned a lot of things about fluid dynamics that I never thought mattered. So, it's been a learning experience for me as well.
Great, thank you. So let's dive straight into your research overview. What's the spark? What kicked off your interest in exploring how water moving over surfaces can generate electricity?
I might just start with this, Joe, and then you can jump in. So for me, this started, I think, by seeing a seminar from Joe talking about all his new software he developed for measuring how water moved over surfaces. And as I said, we've been working for quite a few years on these energy harvesting materials. And I had a hypothesis that, as water moves, it has to be generating charge from friction at this surface. Turns out that's not what it does at all. At least we're not convinced that's what it does. But I sat down for a coffee and said, Joe, can we give this a try? I think it'll be really cool. And Joe said, yeah, that's great. And went away and talked to another professor and came back and said, the other professor thinks other people have done it. We shouldn't do it. And so we had another coffee and another conversation. I convinced him and twisted his arm. And then Joe's just been brilliant. He's just gone, once he's done the first experiments and seen something that works, he's just taken it and run with it and taken it in directions I'd never expected. So sort of that value of this cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary studies where you find things completely unexpected from just mutual interest, really.
So I'm going to disagree completely with Peter here because it was a seminar that he gave that sparked the interest. But so I'm working on another project, which is a fellowship, which is funded over 4 years, looking at how and why liquids wet surfaces. And this is important, across nature and industry. Liquids interact with solids in everywhere that you can imagine. And understanding how and why liquids, wet surfaces, allows us to design better paint. It allows us to come up with better ways to repel water from sitting on power lines and freezing, which can prevent electricity going through. And also things like adhesion of bioorganisms on ship hulls. That's a big problem. And there's lots of ways where liquids interact with surfaces that we don't quite understand. So my project, the larger project, involves using big data or data-driven approaches to understand this process. So I've always been interested in water moving on a surface. And then Peter gave this seminar on charge generation of surfaces moving over other surfaces. And I think I asked him, this is obviously my recollection, and we differ here. I think I asked him whether you could harvest energy from rain. And he's right, we did have a couple of coffees. And then we decided to just do an exploratory project with a couple of master's students. And it just grew from there because we started measuring something interesting that we didn't understand. And now 3 years later, we do understand some of it. And
I think this is the point. This was all a long time ago now. I think we started these conversations when COVID was still going crazy throughout Victoria. So it's been a journey and we've developed it a long way, but we've done some really fun things. And I think, what we've shown is really quite simple, but it was really hard to get there. And so it's been, like I said, a lot of fun, and learned a hell of a lot from Joe about these fluid dynamic processes over the journey.
I'm loving the bromance that's going on here. Like I asked, what's the spark? And the spark is obviously this.
Yeah, it's fun working with Peter.
Oh, that's lovely.
I think I drive him crazy.
Okay, so just in layman's terms, can you guys break down the stick-slip motion of water and its full effect on creating electrical charges for us?
Yeah, sure. I can take that much if you like, Peter. So, we'd all be familiar with water drops moving on a surface, say the windscreen of your car when it's raining. And the way that the drops move, they don't move at a uniform speed. Sometimes they get stuck, then they fall off. Obviously, ideally, we want them to come off because we want to be able to see out of our windscreen when we're driving. But what happens is no surface most industrially relevant surfaces are not atomically smooth and they're not chemically uniform. So you might get areas on your surface where if a drop's moving over, it will stick temporarily, maybe to some sort of surface roughness or chemical structure that's there on that surface. And so the rest of the drop tries to move around this stuck point. And essentially what happens is the drop then jumps and energy gets dissipated. And in our work, what we've done is we've correlated this stick-slip behavior or this energy dissipation to a generation or a transfer of electrical charge.
Okay, so when you say that the droplet jumps, do you mean like a literal jump or?
No, not off the surface. You will see the interface where it gets stuck locally does actually move quite quickly relative to the rest of the drop. So there's kind of this local sticking and slipping or jumping that happens as the droplet overcomes this stuck point on this physical roughness or chemical non-uniformity.
Do you guys have a video of that? I'm sure you would.
Yeah. We have many videos. So Joe has as part of the setup, and we'll get to this in a little bit, I think, but Joe's set up cameras that film every single droplet he measures. And so you can literally see it getting stuck and then popping over. Again, not actually leaving the surface, but going from stop and the water comes over the top like a wave cresting and then just pushes past that point and keeps the droplet shape going. Lots of cool videos.
Moving on to the technical insights part of our podcast, how do you go about measuring these ninja-like electric charges from water drops, and what kind of tech wizardry does that involve?
I might take this one to start with. So the setup is deceptively simple. What we have is we've got a syringe that's mounted vertically, and we have a polymer sheet that's flat underneath. Below that polymer sheet, we have our electrical kit. So this is an electrode connected to what we call an electrometer. This is like a bit of a fancy multimeter, voltmeter that electricians might work with around your house just to measure the voltage or current you get out. what we do is with that syringe pump sitting on the polymer, we program it to expand and contract a little droplet on the surface. So we're using reasonably small droplets from around 20 to 50 microliters up to around 500 microliters. We change the speed in which we expand and contract the drop. The technical wizardry is sort of what I alluded to before, and this is Joe's domain. He has cameras set up that capture how the water moves across that polymer. So when it sticks, when it gets stuck on that point that's not atomically smooth or has a different surface chemistry or is slightly charged or something like that, we can see it get stuck and we can see it jump. And while we're doing that, because we have all the electrodes set up underneath that's measuring the charge, we can correlate that in time to when electricity is being generated. This really interesting thing about this is while it's deceptively simple, it's very different to how everyone's really looked at it before. Most people have measured these things really by two ways. One, by having a droplet rolling down a surface, mimicking that sort of windscreen description that we use as a relatable point. But the problem with this is you can't tell when charge is being generated, i.e. when the droplet's wetting a surface or when it's drying the surface. And so in our system, we have really precise control. And because of that time correlation between droplet getting bigger and electrical charge generation, we can separate out those processes that people haven't done. So it's sort of a combination of technical wizardry and just looking at a simple experiment in a different way that's let us find this. Joe, did you want to throw anything on the end of that or anything I missed?
No, that was beautiful.
Okay, cool. So just moving on to real-world impact. Dr. Berry, could you talk to us about why we should care about electrical shock in fuel containers and how your discoveries could help keep things safe?
Yeah, right. So I think that in terms of fuel safety now, we have very good mechanisms in place to prevent this from happening. But we don't actually understand this very well from a fundamental perspective. So there's lots of engineering solutions put in place to mitigate charge accumulation at an interface where you're transporting or moving or using fuels to prevent electrostatic shock. So what happens? Sorry, let me start again. So the amount of charge that we're measuring is very small. So it's probably 1 million times smaller than what you would get jumping on a trampoline. So it's not a lot of charge, but it's really important when we are using fuels, because fuels are not very good at moving charge away. So if a charge does build up on a surface where we're transporting or using fuels, then it stays there. And if you expose the fuel then to air, then you can get a discharge, which causes a spark, and that can lead to an explosion or a fire. So electrostatic discharge is a really big problem in industry. And there's lots of solutions that have been put in place to prevent this from happening. So, for example, we can ground our equipment so that any charge that builds up gets dissipated. Or we can use conductive additives in the fuel, which take the fuel away from the surface and move it with the fuel so that there's not a large amount of charge present to cause a discharge. And also, because these are all mechanisms that we use together, we also reduce flow rates. So if you're filling up your car at the petrol station, it does take a reasonably long time because we have to restrict the amount of fuel flowing over the surface to reduce the amount of charge that's built up. So there's lots of engineering solutions that we have in place currently with current fuels that make it very safe. But we are moving to new fuels. We need to transition to net zero. So we need to move to sustainable renewable fuels, and they're going to have different properties. They're stored at different pressures and temperatures to what we're currently used to. So we're going to need new solutions to mitigate charge buildup and prevent fire and explosion with these new fuels. And our hope is that we can potentially use these findings to potentially design maybe surface coatings of particular structure or chemistry that can mitigate this charge buildup and prevent fire or explosion.
I'm just going to throw something on there. Why should you care? Number one, because it's super cool. This is something that we've looked at for, humanity's known water flows over their bodies, over trees, whatever, for tens of thousands of years, right? We've just found something completely new about how water interacts with its environment. For me, that joy of discovery is just something that's amazingly inspiring, like for me to do my job, basically. We're still a long way from that application piece of actually making fuel safer. And as Joe said, the transportation and flammable fluid handling industry have an absolutely impeccable safety record as it is. And this discovery is just giving them another tool to continue that record moving forward as we move into more advanced fuels we know much less about, how they interact. And so it's that fundamental discovery that really will underpin future safety design, policy, engineering solutions. But we're a long way away from sort of making our own device that does it yet.
Great. I guess kind of on that note, how could your findings help engineers or designers make smarter and safer materials? I know you guys kind of touched on it.
Well, what sort of my research looks at overall is trying to make better ways of converting or storing energy. And no matter where you do this, this typically is at an interface between a liquid and a solid. The fact that we've found this new discovery and it's 10 times more charge from water than we've previously thought, if we can capture that and use it in next generation batteries that are using water as an electrolyte rather than flammable liquids, we might be able to achieve faster charging. And we haven't demonstrated that at all, but that's sort of the rationale behind it. We have this knowledge. We now know it's there. We know it is really, really consistent. Our Shuaijia, who is an absolutely wonderful PhD student in chemical engineering at the University of Melbourne, did over 500 experiments testing this, like how reproducible it is. It was a lot of work. And so, that informs the next generation of designers. There is this little bit of charge there. It is 1,000,000 times less than a typical static shock, but it's there, it's repeatable, happen every time. Can you come up with a way to capture this, to use it to make your device better? And I think it's just that piece of information that feeds into the next stage of design for a whole host of applications, right?
So I guess we can move into sort of why it matters. So how could this research change the game for manufacturing processes, especially when it comes to safety and energy efficiency?
Well, I can go first if you like, Peter.
Yeah, I'll jump in on top of you at some point, don't I?
Yeah, sure. This is a very fundamental study, and we've only shown that this happens with water on a particular type of polymer. But we're hoping it could be a game changer, and that's really the exciting thing, because we now have a whole range of possible avenues to explore that now that we've discovered something really interesting. But there are static electricity it's a massive problem in manufacturing. So there are two areas where it is a big problem, and one is in product quality. So for example, sensitive electronic equipment, when you're manufacturing, say, RAM for a computer or a motherboard or a graphics card, you've got lots of moving parts, conveyor belts, you've got lots of materials rubbing together, and they all create charge. And if there's enough buildup of that charge, you get a discharge, and that can damage sensitive electronic equipment. And I think that there's estimates that this costs the industry, it costs billions of dollars a year. So it's a really intense focus for manufacturing of electronic equipment to reduce the amount of charge that's built up. And potentially, this is a bit of crystal balling, perhaps we could use the droplet as a low-cost probe to measure how much charge is built up and maybe come up with ways to prevent this charge build-up. So a lot of these electronic equipment, there's lots of mechanisms in place, such as grounding employees, building static-free Faraday cages, and even when you're transporting them in the post, they come in envelopes that are essentially Faraday cages, which block the influence of external electric fields. So there's a lot of work in that area on product quality that affects manufacturing. And the other aspect is obviously, as we've touched on before, is in safety, because static electricity is everywhere. Also in the chemical processing industry, there's a lot of flammable liquids, not just fuels. So lots of solvents that we use in lots of our chemical processes are explosive. And these explosions, although, as Peter said before, there are immaculate safety records, they still do happen. So there was quite a large explosion, I think, in 2008 in Kansas at a solvent handling facility where they were moving a solvent into a tank. And I don't think that they grounded the system properly. And essentially the whole tank exploded and sent a huge fireball and bits of metal into the surrounding community. So this is a big problem in the chemical processing industry, where they're doing these types of things thousands of times a month, where they're filling or emptying a tank of flammable liquids. It's a really big issue. And some sort of more fundamental understanding of how and why static charge builds up when we're handling these liquids can help to mitigate the risks associated with them.
And this sort of comes back to like what's so cool about what we found. It's really the first time people have shown that when a surface goes from dry to wet, you get a big spike of charge. People haven't seen that before. They've known that water leaves like a snail trail of charge behind it as it dries up and leaves some things behind. But there's not much showing the other way. And so in terms of manufacturing processes, where you're using surfaces that alternate between, you're wetting it for one process, drying it for the next, and wetting it again, you're starting to look at this is something that might be having an impact over a long period of time, over those, month periods or year periods where they build up. And so, having a safety protocol of discharging your surfaces every X period of time might be a really safe and simple path forward to prevent something like that Kansas explosion happening, right? And again, very fundamental. We're a long way from proving the application of it, but you can see the opportunities and see how it could be really important for a lot of industries.
Right. I know you guys have talked about manufacturing and stuff, but are there any particular industries that might get a major upgrade from your research? You can mention the obvious ones, but maybe also some not so obvious ones too.
Some not so obvious ones for me are really in places where you're looking to harvest a little bit of extra energy or control where energy is. So a couple of them are sensing. So Joe mentioned it very quickly, like using these water droplets as sensors for where charge is built up on a surface might be a really nice new tool to sort of measure that pre-static discharge effect. Say, hey, look, in these spots, this is what's happening. I'm looking at new generation electrochemical devices. Can we use this to make your battery discharge faster? Or when you're manufacturing them, what do we have to think about? So when you infuse your electrolyte into your battery, how do we make sure that stays safe? Right. And then I'll let Joe cover the more traditional chemical engineering ones. But there's really, if you can think of places where liquids are flowing over solids and going from dry to wet or wet to dry, this is research that you might want to think about it in the context of safety and in the context of there is this little bit of extra charge that we didn't know about happening. And here's why it happens.
Yeah, so I think it's an excellent question, and it's the next obvious question that we are currently thinking about, because I guess the issue here is that liquids are everywhere, charge is everywhere. It is hard to narrow down to a particular industry. And we're interested to hear from people who have a problem that we might be able to help with. But yeah, in terms of, as Peter talked about with sensing, maybe we could even use this as a sensor of liquids. So maybe different liquids generate charge differently, and we might be able to pick up from that signal and determine something about the liquid composition of very small volumes. So there's a wide range of applications that we really need to start narrowing down and focusing on to hopefully come up with something tangible that can really help that particular industry.
And what do you think is next? What are the next big questions or experiments that are on your radar?
What I love about this, and Joe, just talk over me when you need to for this one. There's so many next steps, and there's so many different ways we can see this research branching into really cool applications. What we've shown at the moment is really an observation, right? We showed this happens. We show it's reproducible and repeatable. We need to control it, right? One way or the other. We need to show we can make it happen or we can stop it happening. And that then informs engineering design decisions. But there's a whole other piece about what is the charge we're actually measuring? Is it an electron? Is it an ion? Is it a radical? Is it something else? And where does it go? Where does it sit? We call it irreversible charge because we keep measuring these droplets getting bigger and smaller and it doesn't go away. But what is it? Because if we identify that, we identify where it is, how to control it, then we can really figure out where we can use it precisely and what we can do. And there's so many different things we look at. Joe and I have a meeting once every couple of weeks with Shuaijia, who's the PhD student, and every time we come up with new ideas of what to do next. But I think the first next step is this controlling it, showing that we can really precisely control and we can tune the magnitude, and then going from there.
Yeah, so I agree entirely with Peter. We've found something interesting. So now we need to understand it. And when we've understood it, we can then control it. And then that will hopefully lead to interesting applications where we might want to enhance the amount of charge that we're creating, say, enhance chemical reactions happening at a surface, which is important for batteries, for example, or mitigate it. So remove that charge, which is obviously important for safety. Yeah, but at the moment we're at that, we've found something really interesting and now we need to really understand it and control it And then we'll have, I hope, some really nice specific applications where we can apply.
And I'm going to caveat what Joe's saying there a little bit. We do understand it. It's understanding as a scientist saying we don't fully understand it, as there's always another layer to get down to versus a conventional understanding. But I'm going to throw one random thing out there. So I was reading a news release from a different university. I've forgotten. I think it was Harvard. I might be misquoting here, but they're looking at spraying water droplets as the origin of, as you know, one of the potential regions for the origin of life, because these droplets get a little bit of charge when they spray and they can do some biochemical reactions. And it just sort of shows that the breadth that this simple research on looking at how droplet electrification can go. Our stuff, we're not looking at that at all, but just to give you an idea of there's a million and one directions people are interested in reaching out to try to study with these really basic understandings about how droplets get electrified, basically.
I'm being very conservative as a researcher, but there's a lot that we still don't know. So we've got collaboration with a group in Germany where we're looking at more experiments to understand this a little bit better. So it's a collaboration with
Joe's being very modest here. He's managed to get a collaboration with basically the world leader in droplet electrification. This is a guy who leads his own institute over in Germany, and Joe's met him and had a conversation with him, and he got really excited about the work. And so they've said, hey, come use our setup, come use our understanding to try to build this into a model that can make a real impact in the world. And I think, you know, those academic collaborations are critical to get that control and get that understanding, because if we all stand on each other's shoulders, we'll get much, much further than two people working in a lab by themselves. Sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to talk over you. I'm just like, you're being modest. You got to say how good you are.
I was about to say how good he is, Hans-Jürgen Butt, how good he is, but he's also a lovely guy. So yeah, that's something that's really exciting. And we've got the student who's done all the work, Shuaijia Chen, who needs to be mentioned because he did all of the experiments and set up the equipment as well. He's also got some really promising results currently where we're looking at different types of polymers as well, so different commonly used plastics in industry, and how the chemistry and the surface roughness affects the charge that we're measuring and seeing. So yeah, lots of really interesting stuff, but it was really nice to get something out that's exciting to people, and then we can hopefully follow up with lots of nice new studies.
Yeah. And look, one of the things is, you know, about this being so fundamental, I mentioned at the start, you know, we've been looking at water, you know, people know droplets hit things and roll down things for thousands and thousands of years. One of the cool things about finding something so new is no one's seen it before. But it's also really hard to prove. And so it's taken a long time even to get this, what seems such a very simple thing, to make sure we got it right, to make sure we did know where it was coming from, and we could explain that side of things. The collaboration to have a real world impact, look, we're actively looking at partnering with interested industries, whether that's in the energy sector or the manufacturing sector, or even the chemical synthesis sector, where they think, hey, the research you're doing might have an impact. Please reach out to us. You know, we're looking to build that pathway to a quicker real world impact, in addition to continuing our academic, you know, study of these fundamental processes, because we do think there's big opportunities here. It is 10 times more charge than people have seen typically with droplets. So, you know, if we can capture it and use it for a specific application and target it, there's big opportunities to change how things are done.
Great. And I guess we'll move on to key takeaways here. So if there's one major thing you'd want a young person or fellow engineer to remember from your work, what would it be?
Wow. Okay. So I don't know I don't want to be specific about the work, but the process that we went through, I think, is really, really important, because first of all, we were curious. So we decided to look at something new. And then we were also resilient. So we didn't have any funding. This was put together for this specifically. This was put together on a shoestring budget. And we used some really bright master students from our chemical engineering degree here at Melbourne to help us first build an experiment and to actually measure something. And then for 2 years, we didn't understand what we were measuring. So we were curious to find out what it was, and we were resilient because we didn't give up, right? So we went through an iterative process of measuring something, changing something, measuring again, in order to get something that was repeatable, reproducible, and so then we could then begin to build understanding. So I think the key message from this particular work is to be curious and be resilient, because exciting things can happen.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree with Joe. Like, I can't understate the resilience aspect. There are a lot of things we did where we thought we had an answer and we were just wrong, right? And that's okay. That's part of being a scientist or part of being an engineer, where you're learning and you're discovering as you go. For me, someone starting out, the big thing I want them to take away is this is such a simple system, right? It's water moving on a surface. And we asked a question that most people would have thought we understood everything about how that happened, right? So be curious. Don't assume that because it's an old problem, people have looked at it in all the ways that there are. If you have a good idea, pursue it. Think about it. Try it. As I said a bit earlier, this work, it's given me some of the happiest feelings as a scientist or an engineer, because it's a real joy of discovery. Oh, well, we've seen something no one's really seen before in something as common as water. And that's only come because of Joe and the master students and Shuaijia's perseverance in all these wonderful experiments. And an idea over coffee 3 or 4 years ago now. So it's have that interest, have that passion, ask the questions, and don't just assume the answers. Someone's already done it, because there's a lot of things you can choose to do. They might not have chosen to do that.
And I might just point out also that Peter and I are both in a very lucky position where we are able to be curious. So we are constrained in our job slightly, but we are able to go off and try something. And then if it's interesting, then we can keep going. So we are very lucky in our positions, because often, in industry, we'd be much more constrained, but we were able to think of something cool to try, and it turned out to be very interesting, but it did take a long time.
Thank you, guys. And where can our listeners follow your research or dive deeper into your work?
So our paper's published in Journal Physical Review Letters. It's
Physical Review Letters.
Sorry? Did I say it wrong?
Yeah, Physical Review
Letters.
It's too good to be called a journal. It's a very prestigious physics journal, and they're very old school, very conservative.
But there's media releases out on social media through RMIT University. If you search me up, you will find the media releases there, which go into this in more technical detail and have the link to the technical work. Similarly, for Joe at the University of Melbourne, Melbourne's put together a piece and a story on this that'll come up as you find. If you're curious about it, I'm more than happy. Send me an email. My email is just my first name dot my last name at rmit.edu.au. I'll try to get back to you. Happy to have a chat. I'm always interested about new ideas and see what people think.
Yeah, so I agree. Well, we're both on LinkedIn, so happy to be contacted via LinkedIn. Our email addresses are in the paper, and happy to have a chat to anyone who's interested to learn more.
All right, amazing. And just before we go today, is there anything you guys would like to add or that you think we've missed?
No, I think I'd just like to emphasize the wonderful support the university sector's given us to be able to do this research, right? Joe's a future fellow funded by the Australian Research Council, the Australian government, basically. I'm funded by RMIT University, but without the investment in basic science from the Australian government and from the university sector, these fundamental discoveries, which will have a transformative impact down the track, wouldn't happen.
Yeah, and I guess that we're kind of moving towards research that needs to have an application, but the danger with that is when you're funding research that has purpose is who decides what's purposeful and what's not. So that's fundamental research can often lead to really, really important and valuable discoveries to Australia and the world more generally. And we don't know what they are before we find them. So there's a real danger that we're moving to application-driven discovery, when really discovery in and of itself can lead to new applications and really paradigm shifts in how we do things. So blue sky research is really important and is really valuable.
And much more than really important value, it's fun. We have had a lot of fun doing this. We've discovered some super cool things, and it's a joy to do. It's been a joy to work with Joe, a joy to work with Amanda Ellis in chemical engineering at the University of Melbourne, as well as the broader team. So it's important, it's valuable. It's also, we've had a great time doing it. So we're really proud of what we've done.
And one more thing that probably doesn't need to go on the podcast, but I had a chat to Dale Peterson, he's got a company think based in Sydney, but it's bond line static control solutions. And his whole company just goes around to different industry applications and troubleshoots any issues they're having with static electricity. And he's really entertaining and has some great stories. And I didn't realize how big a problem this was until I talked to him about this. So he'd be someone worth talking to also.
Well, that wraps us up for today. So a huge thank you to you both for unpacking your work today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Sim. It's been lovely to chat to you and to all the listeners out there. We hope you enjoyed it without too much rambling.
Thanks very much, Sim. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of AU Manufacturing Conversations. I'd like to thank Dr. Joe Berry and Dr. Peter Sherrell for sharing their groundbreaking research and helping us better understand how water movement on surfaces generates electrical charges. The implications for manufacturing safety and potential applications in energy storage are truly significant, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this research develops. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to AU Manufacturing Conversations wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more manufacturing news and insights at aumanufacturing.com.au. I'm Simran Gill, and I'll be back next week with another conversation exploring innovation in Australian manufacturing. Thank you for listening.